Part 1 of this series dealt with the pagan origins of the Old Earth time frame. Part 2 examines the uncertainty of origins. I don't debate young Earth, old Earth, because debate implies that we can know what happened in the beginning. We can't. Observation and logic don't work that far back. We just believe one or the other. I will debate the college professor or scientist who says that we have proven that the Earth is billions of years old. We haven't. We can't. Certainty is a lie, and Christians need to make that their message. We need to stand up to the old Earth cancel culture. Before I flesh out a young Earth model in later segments, I need to show you what I'm talking about. You need to understand the limitations of history, radiocarbon dating, and radiometric dating. The most obvious way to establish absolute dates is to tie together historical events that succeed one another. As long as we can link relative time spans to known dates, we can build a reliable timeline. Historical dating is the best method available, but what are its limitations? The good news is that we can be certain about the fall of Thebes. In fact, 664 is the earliest undisputed date in history. In 664, the Assyrian army sacked the city of Thebes in Egypt. It is well established by Berosus, Manetho, the Assyrian Chronicles, the Babylonian Chronicles, the Apis Stellae, and Egyptian monuments. We will refer to this date as our anchor point. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BC and the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC are also known within 1 or 2 years of certainty. Most of the Old Testament, however, falls in a period of time that, well, is not prehistoric, but it is pre-certainty. The times of Moses and of Joseph are disputed by hundreds of years, while Babel and the Neolithic are disputed by thousands of years. The older it gets, the more uncertain it gets. Dates for the origin of life, the solar system, and the universe could be thousands, millions, or billions of years. You might say that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, plus or minus 13.8 billion years. A date is more than a number. It's a number and its precision. Now, geography. Dates are more certain in the Middle East than in Africa, China, India, or the Americas. Why? Well, because the Ark landed in the Middle East and civilizations began along the Euphrates, Tigris, and Nile rivers before they spread out. There are only 3 possible pathways for building an ancient timeline: Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and biblical, all in the Middle East. Biblical history was, of course, located in the middle between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Each of the 3 has uncertainties. Each is largely independent of the others, with only a few questionable links called synchronisms between them. Of the 3 pathways, biblical history was preferred by the earliest archaeologists. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, Egypt became the preferred pathway because 20 other civilizations depend on it, either partly or entirely, for their dates. This includes all the expansion of farming into Europe. 3 pathways in different locations with 3 sets of problems. Let's start by looking at the biblical pathway for dating. It's straightforward, but has some caveats. Even the Jewish kings can have a difference of 45 years. Floyd Nolan Jones places the beginning of Solomon's Temple at 1012 BC. To step back further, we use 1 Kings 6:1, which says that the Exodus was 480 years before Solomon began building the temple. It places it at 1491 BC, again, according to Jones. Exodus 12:40 says that the Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years. Opinions are divided between the short and long sojourn, a difference of 215 years. We use the short sojourn, which means that Abraham entered Canaan in 1921 BC. Finally, the genealogies of Genesis 10 establish the flood at 2348 BC. Many people, however, trust the Greek Septuagint over the Hebrew. It adds 100 years to many of the patriarchs. So there are different ways to construct the biblical timeline, but a simple and straightforward interpretation of the Bible does give us a preferred method. What about Egypt? A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and Egypt has more weak links than strong links. The Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom were strong and well documented, but the rest was not. The Old Kingdom had pyramids, but no written history. The first, second, and third intermediate periods were weak and poorly documented. When we do the math, the poorly documented years of Egyptian history make up 2/3 of the timeline. So why in the world would archaeologists and historians prefer it over the biblical timeline, except for secular bias? One more thing, let's look closer at the TIP, the third intermediate period that comes right before our anchor date. The last period of Egyptian history affects all the dates before it. As you can see, it's possible to shorten conventional dates by as much as 350 years, bringing them in line with the Bible. Kenneth Kitchen established a conventional timeline shown above the dividing line. David Rohl believes it should be 350 years shorter because some dynasties overlap as shown below the dividing line. What is the new chronology? It's a revision that came from an organization in England that grew to 250 scholars between 1985 and 2005. The results of their research has been archived online. Active discussions continue on a message board with almost 900 members and over 10,000 topics of discussion. Dating ancient Egypt is a work in progress. In the end, it all comes down to the question, which do you trust most, Egypt or the Bible? Radiocarbon dating began in 1952. Many people now believe that carbon dating is more accurate and geographically far-reaching than historical dating. That has led to two schools of thought, one that trusts carbon dating and one that trusts historical dating. We also have to wonder if radiocarbon dating is reliable at times and places that cannot be validated by historical dates. Radioactive carbon decays at a steady rate, so the amount of decay should indicate how long a living thing has been dead. The problem is that radioactive carbon in the atmosphere has changed every year. We need to know the exact amount of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere for every year of the past. It's like calibrating any instrument. It's like setting your watch to a better watch. First, we need to identify tree rings for every year of the past. Then we need to measure the amount of radioactive carbon in the ring. That way, when we find a dead plant or animal, we can match it to the graph. This worked well back to a point. Uncertainty increases in the past. You can see from the graph that the raw data differs from the adjusted date by up to 630 years, and we have no way of knowing if the adjusted date is correct. The first step is to obtain tree rings by counting yearly rings back from the present to the past. Dendrochronologists could use the oldest living trees, Methuselah and Prometheus, but they have issues and aren't used for carbon dating. Old Earth proponents want a timeline that goes back much farther than living trees, so they overlap dead trees by matching the ring width patterns. Bear in mind that the rings of bristlecone pines have the width of a sheet of paper or a human hair. Even the European oaks are only 1/3 of a millimeter wide. They call it science and ignore the human component and uncertainties. Only 4 master tree ring chronologies have been constructed, which shows how difficult it is. Are they independent enough to validate one another? It can't be done through tree ring patterns. I don't even think the carbon patterns match well. The radiocarbon curve is merely an average of 3 or 4 of them. Now, bear with me and let me show you how complicated it is to perfectly match dead trees. As I said, the 4 master tree ring chronologies mentioned earlier cannot be validated by comparing their growth width patterns because growth patterns vary over long distances. The only reliable test that I know of for growth patterns was a study done in 1973 between forests only 9 miles apart. The chart here shows all the trees that were needed to build one timeline. Remarkably, the ring width patterns match the other forests back to 3435 BC with only 2 missing rings. This is amazing. So why can't it be done back 12,000 years? Maybe time didn't go back that far. Besides that, I pulled out a section where Lamarche found an anomaly in 2025 BC. Almost no trees overlap. This is a frequent occurrence that happens with floating sections. We need to be able to examine the data. Now we're really getting deep into the nuts and bolts of science. I wanted to see the proof behind the old Earth claims, so I downloaded the raw data of the original master chronologies from the Arizona Tree Ring Laboratory. It wasn't easy, but I wanted to see for myself what they were looking at. This is an Excel graph of the number of trees they found for each year of their reconstruction, Ferguson in red and Graybill in blue. Can we see evidence of creation and the flood? When I go to the classical date for the flood in 2350, I see fast growth of new trees. This is what I would expect to see after the flood. Then I see a section of growth that lasted at least 1,656 years, the time between creation and the flood. The real shocker is to see this dip in both timelines at the time of creation. There are few trees, and the 2 chronologies don't look the same before this point. This is what I would expect to see if a floating segment was spliced on at the beginning because their intention was always to make it as long as possible. I'm not ready to accept the opinions of old Earth scientists when there are such blaring problems and unanswered questions. You may have been thinking, how could 4 different master tree ring chronologies be wrong? Don't they all count tree rings? Not really. The European expert Michael Bailey explains how carbon dating is used to get old dates. Follow along closely as he explains his procedure. Quote, therefore, radiocarbon dates would be obtained for the submasters to place them roughly in time. There was a 7,000-year empty span into which each new section of chronology could be placed. There were more chronologies than available time. At that point, some of the various submasters must be cross-dated. The established procedure: if no cross-dating could be obtained, recourse to radiocarbon dating. Time was filled up to the point where, on the basis of radiocarbon dates, many of the extended chronology sections should have been cross-matching. Since carbon dating was used to extend the timeline, we can't really say that tree rings can be counted back to 10,000 BC. Okay, we've covered a lot. Radiocarbon dating makes great claims, but it depends on master tree ring chronologies that could have problems in the deep past. We have no way to cross-check an artifact that is dated to 10,000 BC to be sure that carbon dating works. We can check it at 612 BC, and it doesn't work. Consider this. A peer-reviewed article in the journal Radiocarbon documented how radiocarbon dates were wrong by 182 years at the fall of Nineveh. That's a lot. The measurement itself was precise to a year or two. This is an anchor date for history. Carbon dating should match history, and it doesn't. People are not being told that many historians don't trust radiocarbon dating. Bernard Neugrosch came to this conclusion, quote, "Chronology is presently at a crossroads. Its students have to decide which direction to follow, that of the scientifically or that of the historically derived dates. Their paths diverge, and it seems that they may never join up again. The decision is therefore crucial and historic." End quote. That concludes our discussion of radiocarbon dating, which deals with living things and only claims dates going back tens of thousands of years. It doesn't even begin to cover the time that mankind is supposed to have existed on Earth according to evolution. Radiometric dating, on the other hand, provides ages in the millions and billions of years. It uses minerals and processes that are generally activated by volcanoes. Ideally, radiometric dating can be used for any time in any place on Earth. It doesn't need history or remnants of living creatures to work. Can we then select any random object in any random location and determine the year it arrived there? This trilobite can be found in the Cincinnati Museum Center with a sign saying that it is 450 million years old. There's no disclaimer saying that it might have been buried by Noah's flood 4,374 years ago. Its date is presented as certain. The assumption is that we can date any fossil or rock using radiometric dating. That would be really cool if we could, but we can't. It's limited. As we saw in the first part of this series, the time frame for millions of years was in place long before radiometric dating came into use. Uranium-238 has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, so it fit well into the pre-existing time frame. Since there's no way to validate radiometric dating outside of its time frame, we must approach it by asking, how consistent and accurate is it at giving the expected results? So, how does it work? The Earth was formed 4.7 billion years ago, so everything on Earth should be 4.7 billion years old, right? How then can we get different dates for, say, the Jurassic and the Triassic? That's because volcanoes reset the clock. The intense heat separates uranium from its daughter element, lead. You could say that volcanoes get the lead out. Of course, this doesn't work perfectly because there's more lead in the world than uranium. It's difficult to find a place that starts with only uranium and no lead, and that is shielded from water erosion for millions of years. Tiny crystals called zircon help immensely. Zircon is a tough crystal smaller than sand, as you can see compared to a penny. Zircon works better than whole rocks at trapping uranium and keeping it inside. We can measure the uranium and lead in a zircon crystal and calculate an age using the decay rate for uranium. There are many decay rates that can be used to date the Earth. Some give young dates, some give old. Uranium has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, so it gives dates in the millions and billions of years. Russell Humphreys has also looked at helium in zircon crystals. Helium is very light, so it leaks out quickly. Using that leakage rate, Humphreys dates zircons at 6,000 years old, plus or minus 2,000 years. You can look at the same specimen and get two different dates. Those who insist on millions of years must selectively ignore the processes that indicate a young age. Another thing we observe in zircon is that concentrations of uranium have halos around them from the radioactive decay. Significant radiohalos can be found in crystals of all ages, which is a problem. Uranium decays slowly, so it takes at least 900 million years for a halo to form, like you see on the right. If uranium decay gives an age over 900 million years, then that makes sense. If the uranium decay is 1 million years old, then the halo shouldn't be there, and it is. We're looking at the same crystal and measuring two different ages. Something is wrong, and it could be the decay rates. We find another troubling anomaly in granite. We can identify uranium and polonium halos by their sizes. Uranium decays into polonium, so their halos should be in the same place, but sometimes they have moved. The half-life of polonium is between 138 days and 164 microseconds, so it had to have moved quickly. The mechanism that it would take to move it is strong hydrothermal activity, which happened during the flood. Now, creationists placed the first 150 days of turbulent rising floodwaters in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. This is when we see the highest number of radio halos. What we observe matches our expectations. Creationists place the time of receding waters in the Tertiary. When we examine granite from that period, we find fewer displacements. It's striking to find so much sudden movement within hard rocks, and even more to see how it changed after the flood waters subsided. I like to keep an open mind and recognize that both young Earth and old Earth models are worthy of consideration, but there is a growing movement among Christians to silence the young Earth position. A book by Young and Sturley, for instance, explains how old Earth dates are as certain as gravity, and that young Earth is like still believing the sun and stars revolve around the Earth. Gravity, however, can be experienced by anyone, anywhere, and the age of the Earth is very complex and far from certain. Young also writes that young Earth belief is damaging to the Christian cause and alienates intelligent seekers. Such a negative attitude is entirely uncalled for, especially in view of the uncertainty of absolute dating. Popularity is not science. Neither is avoiding discussion. Christians need to be involved in science. Christians need to look at the data. I don't want to be silenced as long as there are questions to be answered. I really want to know, does radiometric dating work? To see for myself, I searched and found the official site for the geologic column at stratigraphy.org, which is maintained by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. The snippet at the left shows stages of the Jurassic and Triassic that are defined by GSSPs, global boundary stratotype sections and points, which are spikes that are nailed into rocks all over the world to mark the boundaries between stages. Notice that the stages are narrowly defined as lasting several million years and having a tolerance of about 1 million year. You would think from all the hype that we hear that we would find precise radiometric lab results for each stage. Boy, was I surprised to see that the boundaries are determined by fossils and no radiometric dates are even given. The boundaries are not clearly defined by science, but are debated in committee, and many are uncertain. I also looked at the locations where the pins are placed. The defining boundaries are never in the same place, but spread all over the world, as shown on the map. Most people only see the picture of a geographic column that appears in books. The geographic column is actually a rather nebulous concept that is not defined by radiometric dating. Of course, radiometric dates do exist, so I wanted to know how closely they correlate with the geologic column. I thought I might find that by searching the official U.S. Geochron database of peer-reviewed radiometric measurements. The database contains 200,000 published measurements from over 35,000 samples. That's a lot, so I limited it to the uranium, thorium, lead method in the Mississippian and Devonian period. That gave me 1,202 samples, most of which are shown on the map. Others are in Alaska and Europe. It surprised me that they are not evenly distributed and often come from the same area and report. To examine the data more closely, I imported it into Excel. I was surprised to find that 96% of the samples came from zircon. When I looked through the 1,149 zircon samples, 36% of them came from sand, which means that it was not physically located in a cleanly defined stratum. That defeats my purpose of trying to tie dates to stages in the geologic column. Where's the correlation? How certain are radiometric dates? Do the measurements always match reality? If they did, I wouldn't be showing you this video. We can actually test the radiometric dating method by comparing the results to a securely established historical date. Mount Naruho in New Zealand erupted 60 years ago, which we know for sure. The lava has been measured with 4 different results. The potassium-argon method places the eruption in the Ice Age. It's so uncertain that it covers 4 stages and not even the right one. The rubidium-strontium method places the eruption at the time of the supposed Chicxulub mass extinction of the dinosaurs. The samarium-neodymium method places the eruption at the beginning of the Jurassic with the pterodactyls. The lead-lead method places the eruption between the Archean and Hadean before life was supposed to have begun and shortly after the Earth formed. Not only do all the methods disagree, but they're also out of range and exaggerate the eruption almost as far as they could possibly be wrong. If we can't trust radiometric dating at known dates, how can we trust it as unquestionable proof of the old Earth position? The Earth might be billions of years old. Countless scientific articles support that time frame. We don't really know. If it's true, God is still God. It seems to me, however, as laid out in part 1, that the pagan ideas of reincarnation and eternal matter influenced the Enlightenment to the point that they abandoned Genesis, calling it a myth. As a result, most people have never understood history in a biblical time frame. They only understand it in an old Earth time frame. What I propose in future segments is to allow the Bible to dictate history. We can't be so tied to tradition and popularity that we're unable to examine the facts. The footnotes in your Bible might be wrong. Timothy Mahoney saw patterns of evidence that were more significant to him than conventional dates, and we want to look at those. Noah, Nimrod, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Saul, David, Solomon, and many others have a lot to show us as people of history rather than just Bible stories. Next time, we want to look into Jonah. The principle of uncertainty is the key that takes off the shackles that keep us from seeing God's mighty deeds come alive.